Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We're gonna give folks a minute or so to get back online, sit down with their coffee, water, coming back from lunch. We appreciate the great conversation this morning as the one of the core authors on the work that was discussed, that recent IR that posted. I definitely liked hearing all the feedback from the panelists, seeing all the great questions that came in from the audience. That's all going to be very helpful for us as we work to tune that IR coming out of the response to EO 14028. So, our consumer profile work and the cybersecurity for IoT parlance. We are welcoming written comments sent to IoT security at NIST.gov on that document. You can find the document at csrc.nist.gov. NIST IR 8425, excuse me, our new one. I have all the numbers committed to memory. Again, our consumer profile, if you search that on CSRC at NIST, you'll be able to find it there. And give it a read. A lot of similar content from what we had in that white paper, but give some explanation. We're hoping to pull it out into this IR so we can maintain it and use it like we use all of our IR reports here at NIST. Excuse the redundancy. It's a good vehicle one way or the other. Good to have the number to refer to in some cases, but also having that NIST stamp on it helps us easily refer to it and folks can easily find it. And it's not buried as as part of a recommendation of something else. We feel it stands as a consumer profile related to our cybersecurity for IoT work overall. So but at the same time, we're also maintaining those over time, understanding that it's a changing market and the thoughts are still swirling as that panel and the questions highlighted, I think. So if you take the time to read that and you have any kind of thoughts, please do send us any comments, positive or negative. We definitely welcome them all. It's always helpful for us to get a pulse on how folks are feeling about our work, especially if you've never responded to a NIST document before. Highly encourage you to. It's not necessarily the most fun process, emailing comments, but I think it's valuable and it's always good for us as our team to have new and novel insights. So enough about the IR. We're going to move on to our topic for today's panel, the product cybersecurity strategy. How do cybersecurity requirements fit into IoT product development? Joined today by a number of great thought leaders in this space, product cybersecurity for IoT, either coming from it as an enterprise customer organizational representative, through their experience or whatnot, or having studied it, either here at NIST or outside of NIST. All of our panelists bring really interesting, I think, perspectives to the overall discussion today, which will be about IoT cybersecurity risks and the way products are used and come together and how that might impact the risks that you have to deal with when you're considering them from a cybersecurity perspective. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction for everyone to give you a lay of the land, and then we'll jump right into our first topic, and everyone will get a chance to speak with their own voice if I do miss anything. First, we have Dr. David Wollman, who is the Deputy Division Chief of the Smart Connected Systems Division in the Communications Technology Laboratory here at NIST. In addition to expanding NIST's research activities in cyber-physical systems and the Internet of Things, David has extensive experience in smart grid, including building up NIST's smart grid program and accelerating the development of smart grid interoperability standards. David received his PhD in condensed matter physics from the University of Illinois and has received many awards from the Department of Commerce and also holds 3 U.S. patents. I stumbled there on your name. I'm going to, similar to our last panel, we have 2 Davids, so I'm going to take note to refer to David Wollman as David and Dave Elfering, who I'll introduce in a moment. He's the next up as Dave Elfering. He's an enterprise security leader who began his career in spacecraft operations at the U.S. Air Force and at NASA. With over 2 decades as a security leader at Werner Enterprises, Dave saw the evolution and increased dependency on IoT in a critical industry sector. Today, he manages security risk at ResourcePro, a global insurance services and technology company. We're also joined by Dr. Larry Ponemon, who's chairman and founder of the Ponemon Institute. The Institute was founded more than 20 years ago and is focused on conducting research on cybersecurity, data protection, and consumer privacy. The Ponemon Institute's goal is to conduct research that advances the responsible use of sensitive and confidential information. I think we all know how IoT touches on these areas, so I know Larry has a lot of interesting work that he's done touching on OT, IoT. Finally, we're joined by Dr. Dan Hein, who is a principal security architect at Garmin, where he focuses on secure design, training and awareness, and practical integration of secure software development practices into the engineering workflows. Dr. Hein holds a PhD in computer science and MS in computer engineering from both from the University of Kansas and a BS in computer engineering from Iowa State. He has over 20 years of experience in software development, primarily focused on embedded systems, including space satellite instrumentation, mobile apps and handsets, automotive infotainment, personal navigation systems. Security and privacy has been a focus of his work for over 15 years. So I think as these bios reflect, I'm more than excited to get into the conversation. From our prep discussions, I know everyone is bringing a lot of great ideas to discuss today. First topic, I just wanted to, as we heard, right, folks have done their research or have done their work even in a lot of different areas that are going to have different risks that are involved. Theoretically, it's pretty simple to see how a truck is going to be different than a GPS, but they also build on each other. A truck uses a GPS, or at least the truck driver might. And there's connections and interconnections between products and the customers that use them into what, it's not a product necessarily, maybe it's a service they're providing, and all of the components that go into their broader system. And these different domains are going to bring in all sorts of different additional risk considerations, safety and privacy, which I know some of our other panelists have looked at. So before we got into any of the nitty gritty, I just wanted to give every panelist a moment to talk about what are some of the IoT use cases that they've come across in their work. They would want to give a little bit of time to, if felt a bit interesting, or really highlighted some of these challenges that we're going to be talking about today. First, maybe David Wollman, give us some ideas.
Sure, thanks, Mike. I'd like to mention two interesting use cases. One is energy IoT for the residential consumer, and then the other is automated vehicles. So for the first one, as we're modernizing our electric grid to enable more renewables, like rooftop solar, for example, and as we make our appliances and home systems more responsive to locally manage energy usage and coordinate more with the grid, this opens up new capabilities for decentralized grid edge control and management, and this energy IoT can then be used in local microgrids for improved resilience, for example. The other example is automated vehicles and AI-based automated driving systems, which have to monitor the conditions and control real-time driving function and behaviors for safe operation, including onboard and offboard communications and sensor data fusion and analysis and much more. And as our vehicles are the home away from home, they represent an important IoT product platform category that's already part of our daily lives. So overall, with both of these use cases as examples, I believe that automation and autonomy are really the future of IoT. And so I think that's a thread that we'll explore today. And in both of them, cybersecurity is very important, but so also are safety and resilience and other attributes. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, David. I think that idea that IoT isn't the be-all, end-all is a key to our work here at Cybersecurity for IoT, even in the sense of where we zoom down at a device or a product and how that doesn't necessarily, like I said, GPS might be then used in a truck, delivering a service in and of itself. IoT itself builds up like you're highlighting, David, overall broader service based on big data. I guess we don't use that term much these days, but machine learning that uses large data sets. Some of those large data sets are probably going to come from IoT. And on top of that, the home automation or any automation system is going to react to feeds from increasingly IoT devices. So I completely agree there that the interconnection between IoT, AI, and automated decision making is only going to increase over time. And I think you saw some of that in your work, Dave Elfring, at Werner, but maybe even today, how that trajectory has increased. So what is your thoughts on some IoT use cases you've seen?
I think some of this reflects the changes in society, and we see like our global supply chain challenges right now, and this certainly factors into that. And I'll go back through a quick history. If you go back to 1997, we had one major player, Qualcomm. Today they're known for doing something else, but they started with telematics and trucks, and this is what I'd call in space operations terms the Sputnik phase. It beeped, it did something, it was fairly closed. Maybe it was even kind of amusing, but it was critical, to the transportation industry, and it was considered super high tech. And these things have over time become more consumerized in terms of, not everybody could use or needed satellite-based communications, which Qualcomm used. And it almost seemed like magic, right? Hey, we can see where the fleet is. We got very, very basic information, telemetry, telematics, where's the truck? How fast is it going? Did they stop? How long have they been stopped? And you fast forward to what I'd call the Voyager phase, right? A little more complexity. We now had a Windows embedded system, which had more functionality, more security risks. Prior to that, it was a closed system. We couldn't really see into it. There weren't really too many concerns. We just went, oh, it works, good. Turn it on, and the fleet goes. And now we had a system that we knew we could root pretty quickly. There were security flaws being introduced into supply chain. And as a CISO at a large transportation carrier, I did not have my role was more with the integration, the triage, and make it secure. So there's the whole selection process. If you go back to 2008, CISOs weren't typically in that discussion. And you fast forward in complexity now to, full cloud integration, full third-party integration at the OEM level. So now we're expecting not only detailed telematics that determine the operation of our fleets and our supply chain, but integration in order to affect changes in those trucks. So, for example, diesel engines have certain periodic maintenance cycles that are required. We can do that. We can reset the speed, for trucks that are governed. And so now we have a nested system in which, again, if you look at the ability of the CISOs and the IT teams, they're looking at it from a product standpoint. They may not have the voice into the security of the platform. And that's why I think there's so much value to this panel, to the panelists and these discussions, because, operators are going to operate, and that's what fleets do, unless they're very heavily involved with the OEMs. And so, we're a consumer like everybody else to some degree, even though we had massive amounts of complexity on top of it.
Yeah, those are a lot of interesting, just for everyone to know, we're kind of just highlighting some of those tidbits of the discussion that are going to become today. So I know both David and Dave in particular are highlighting some really interesting thoughts that we'll definitely be digging into down the line. It is interesting to hear the evolution in trucking and transportation over time. I'm sure I could guess at least it's similar in other kinds of transportation and the kinds of sensors and at least GPS that goes into that. Again, we'll hear a little bit more about that from Dan down the line. But I also want to, I know, Larry, your work has brought in a lot of different IIoT use case sectors as well as beyond. I wanted to see if you could give us some idea about where you've looked in your work, what sectors you've looked at, what were some of at least the high-level insights, just to start us off that you heard and seen. Oh, you're muted, Larry. I think AV could probably pull you off if you have it. There you go. Nope. Can we, AV, can we unmute Larry through the blue jeans here? You should be unmuted now, Larry.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep, there you go. Great.
No, great. I apologize. I'm not sure what I did wrong, but yeah. So again, my role here is not necessarily a domain expert in IIoT, but or IoT, but we do a lot of research covering this emerging technology. It's not actually emerging; it's already emerged. And so we've done in total as a research institute over 10 studies, independent studies. Most recently, a study with Microsoft. The areas that we've looked at are things like some of the points that have already been raised, automotive, logistics, very important. Healthcare also is on our radar screen, wearable and implanted devices. You talk about really weird things, but these technologies exist, and for the most part, they're pretty safe, but there are privacy implications, and some of those we've studied as well. So again, we've done quite a bit of work. Just one technology as a user, I mentioned this during our prep session. I'm a pilot, well, not a very good pilot because I don't ever fly, but one of the reasons for that is I almost had a plane crash flying my plane from Michigan to Washington, D.C. It was over Lake Ontario at 25,000 feet, single engine airplane, hit bad weather, and then my engine just stopped and my plane became what you call a rock. Fortunately, I ended up having a good communication with tower, And I had a technology Garmin 1000 that basically more or less flew the plane for me, because otherwise I'd have been panicking. And ended up landing the plane successfully. Now that Garmin 1000, I suppose, is a type of IoT technology, or at least could be, but it was definitely life savings in my case. So again, we do a lot of research. For the folks on the panel, very impressed with your resumes. I think you're all doing great work. And we're always looking to expand our group of folks who are doing research in this area. So, again, off the record, maybe at some point we could talk about how we might collaborate in the future. Thanks, Michael, for giving me an opportunity to join this illustrious podcast panel.
Of course, Larry, and thanks for bringing that insight and perspective, both from the personal perspective and all the work you do. We definitely look forward to hearing more about what the Ponemon Institute and the work you've done with it has brought up around cybersecurity, privacy in IoT and IoT understanding. Maybe you're looking at more of that perspective across the board, and now the impacts that are obvious there for IoT, IIoT have brought them more into your view. Maybe a similar reason why our group exists, cybersecurity for IoT. Early days, we looked at what those deltas for IoT were, because especially in the early days, you heard a lot of, well, what's different about IoT? Especially cybersecurity? Why do we even need to think about this separately from IT cybersecurity, general conventional cybersecurity? And one of the key things is a lot of assumptions are broken, and also another really key delta is that IoT brings in safety, privacy, other sorts of implications for humans that are certainly there for conventional IT, but it's a different supply chain, as we heard on the last panel. It's also just sort of a different environment as well. They might just be heightened, perhaps more obvious, and if it's a connected device, if it's a connected device that's meant to save your life when you're in a plane, you don't want it to be updating when you need it at 25,000 feet. To give the most simplistic, I'm sure, well, of course, I'm more than sure, I'm sure we'll hear from Dan about how that's completely impossible. So to not vamp too much longer, just want to give Dan Hein from Garmin an opportunity to move off of what Larry said there, giving your company's products a little bit of a here, har, and tell us a little bit about the work you've worked in, wherever it's been, be your PhD or at Garmin, and kind of some of those interesting IoT use cases and insights you have.
Sure. I'll talk a little bit, maybe not so much about Garmin, but just more generally. And the legal disclaimer I have to give is, although I work for Garmin, my views that I'm going to express here in the panel don't necessarily reflect those of Garmin. But definitely a lot of my experience is informed by that work. And one of the places, as it relates to use cases, is with respect to the wide variety of products that Garmin, for example, manufactures. We serve automotive, aviation, outdoor, and sports areas across product offerings so diverse as like a trap shooting radar gun to help hunters and outdoorsmen improve their target hit ratio when they shoot clay pigeons, to fish finders to help fishermen and anglers out in the water, to navigation devices that more people are probably familiar with, and everything there in between. A lot of our focus on those kind of like the standalone devices that then have increasing connectivity has really been about the user's privacy and the informed nature of that. And to give an appreciation for the diversity and the challenge to the earlier panel, the main thing that I'm trying to advocate in as much as a capacity that I could state for Garmin would really be that harmonization that was mentioned in the earlier panel. Really, given the diversity of IoT products, we need to make sure that we have a consistent application. If we have to do security thing X, Y, and Z for a product, who tells us that that's been good enough, given perhaps a sliding scale with the diversity of all these devices that I've mentioned that have a wide range of risk profiles and implications. And sort of as an example of that, drawing from privacy, I just went out and counted before the panel because I thought it would be good to just kind of get an estimate. We have 17 different privacy policies due to the diversity of products that Garmin manufactures because of the various segments and customers that they serve, that we serve. Again, trying to make sure I separate me from them as a representative of the panel, but to give an idea of how diverse, just as one company, making products that are increasingly considered, consumer products that are increasingly considered in the IoT space. And one of the kind of the biggest daily questions that I grapple with is this product in scope for this new IoT stuff that's coming down the pike?
Oh, interesting. It's interesting to hear all the different things that Garmin puts together, and also their focus on privacy. It seems very natural, and it's good to hear that it's on the radar. Before we get into the next topic, I just wanted to get our first poll question up there. Folks may have seen our team posted a discussion essay to help fuel some of the thoughts that we'll be discussing on this panel in particular, but also around cybersecurity overall. In it, we talk a lot about risk identification and the layers of where those risks, particularly cybersecurity risks, can come from. So the question is, which most influences IoT cybersecurity risks? The options being technologies, use cases, or customers. Technologies being what the device does or what it's made of. It might have a cloud, it might have an app. Use cases being how it's used, and then customers are who's using it. So, to the best of your abilities, give us an answer what you think on that one. And then I'm going to go right back to you, Dan, kind of going right off of the tail end of your comments there. In the paper, we talk about emergent use cases. So manufacturer will make a product, and over time, aspects of how they made it, what they made, what's needed changes. And maybe even how their product, we talk a lot in the paper about how the product's used, because our work's focused a lot about that customer manufacturer relationship in the sense of what the product provides and what the manufacturer provides. And the last panel should highlight that for folks. So, this emergent use case can be, this emergence of many things can happen in different ways. So in the prep call, we had talked a little bit about, and you had brought some insights from how kind of there's some supply chain aspects to that, and how what you put into a product can change over time, or what you need to put out as a product can change over time. What have you seen in your work related to that? Like I said, going right off of what you were.
Yeah, when a single entity or organization kind of controls all those different pieces, and really this is building off the NIST definition of product being the device itself, any supporting mobile app and or back-end service as part of that ecosystem product overall. That's where we're talking about these different components that come into the supply chain. So from an engineering perspective or development perspective, and from the perspective of a single organization, when you go through that risk assessment process and that point-in-time assessment, where you may also be filling out a conformity assessment or something similar, you have an idea of what the intended approved use is and what the likely context is and the state of things that as it stands at that point in time when you're designing the product. This is really kind of your question really is kind of hooking back to the earlier panel's notion of a life cycle based approach, which is really justifying the need for that, so that when changes occur in any one of those variables, like let's say someone else, it's not the single organization anymore supplying the back end service, it's a different entity entirely. It's a different cooperating enterprise or business to business relationship that you're working with now. How did that change? How did that change the dynamics of the risk analysis in the situation? And so being able to, I think it's important consideration for any kind of market surveillance functions that would be out there looking at this related work, being able to kind of identify that and have some notification connection, some communication paths for, hey, you're using this in a way that you didn't necessarily think you were originally going to deploy this in. This was not made for that intended use. And I know David had said some stuff in an earlier discussion around sort of emergent use cases related to solar panel monitors and things that I think is really interesting there. So hoping he'll talk again about that. But that's really the that's really the key is kind of when you have different suppliers of those pieces or those pieces change, do they ascribe to those same processes that you might have used if you were sort of that organization putting your label on the box? So the earlier panel mentioned BMW and some sort of an unlocking application. So that would be a good example here, harkening back to that example that was given where they probably outsourced that to some other body. And, at the end of the day, depending on your branding and who you are, what name is going quote unquote on the product or on the box, it kind of breaks down in the IoT case. But that's kind of where I think some of the insights and some of the questions are raised that you're wanting me to hit on there.
Oh, certainly, yeah. No, I think one of the key ones is this complexity of the technologies, that what you're using to build a product is going to change over time. And I think that there's a multi-layered problem in the sense that, Garmin can solve that for their supply chain, but they're a link in the supply chain. We'll be getting to David Wollman's examples around smart grid a bit later, because I think that also ties into a bit of emergent customers as well. New customers that you may not have expected using a product differently than how you expected them to use it. Then kind of highlighting, if you go to our poll that's open for folks to remind you to answer that if you have some thoughts. But I think customers actually has in our work, it's one of the main things we think about, the kind of customer you're dealing with. When you're talking about cybersecurity, the approaches to cybersecurity are generally focused on that end customer, whoever they may be. So, what do we do about cybersecurity in general? Well, tell users to make better passwords and tell them to update their software. What do we do about enterprise cybersecurity? Well, we make cybersecurity frameworks and risk management frameworks, and we ask them to use it. It's all really focused heavily on what the end customer has to do, which can reverberate back through the supply chain. But in the end, it's just sort of the fact of life. I think, as Dave Elfring highlighted, operators operate, and that's kind of what it is, right? So let's secure the operations is usually the first go-to. But I think we can see how then on that customer side, we heard from the supply, maybe the supplier, manufacturer side, how that same drift can happen over time. Use cases can emerge either that you build towards, new things you want to do, or maybe new things you're forced to deal with, perhaps with the products that come along. I know, again, from the prep call, you had a bit of insights on that, and Dave could share them with us now.
Yeah, I think, if I'm thinking about, the key changes, and I hit on some of these earlier, like a lot of areas of technology, but we're looking at this critical supply chain. Everybody's extremely and painfully aware of supply chain issues at the moment. And I think the way I would say it is that in terms of what are the security requirements and the management and the integration and our expectations, think about Amazon and Prime, and we've gone from, hey, I want this in a day. I want it delivered in a day. And so that has a stress on supply chain. And what it means is that in the supply chain industry, we've gone from, the old original Qualcomm units to new, completely embedded and integrated units that are very complex, layered tech stacks built on and integrated with one another. Both, at the truck and the trailer and the gates, or all of the yards where goods come and go. And so the expectation is these things all work together. So we've gone from months to moments in terms of management and our expectation and our ability to respond and manage. And that's taken the form of changes in the complexity of what we expect and what we do with all of the embedded technology in the trucks and in the trailers and elsewhere throughout the entire enterprise. In terms of, we now not only want to know the speed and direction of the truck, did it stop? We want to be able to initiate maintenance processes in terms of trucks' departiculate filters, have a periodic reset that has to be engaged. Prior to that, the truck had to stop, go somewhere, and transportation companies were losing millions of dollars. Because if you take a fleet of 10,000 trucks and you say, well, just bring them into the shop, the logistics of bringing 10,000 trucks into the shop could take 6 months to a year. Trucking companies don't have 6 months to a year. They've got to deliver that prime freight, right? So there's a pressure from the economy side. And then on the integration side, the IT departments of trucking companies, large trucking companies, have grown from 24 people to 200, 400, 500 people, and they're all working directly on this. And so we're consumers with a level of complexity that is typically not encountered at the consumer level. And these are some of the changes, and these are societal, technological, and then the pressure is on these OEMs. We need you to crack this open and let us look in here, which introduces opportunity. But it's not just our opportunity, it's opportunity for other people that may not have the motives, that we have. And these are the things that the enterprise security leadership at transportation companies think about and worry about. But the reality is, quite often we're confined to triage, to managing the daily fires, to, hey, we've got 500 of these units, get them rolled out. Oh, hey, you're in charge of identity and access management. Make sure that all of the drivers can log in. Don't ever log them out. Don't ever ask them to change their password, which goes back again to, you want to drive that CISO crazy? Give them those kinds of scenarios. But at the same time, the CISOs are having to engage with the supply chain, which can be legal department, for example. Are we indemnified? How do we indemnify this? And then legal asks the logical question of, what's our risk here? What's the risk of this system? And there's things in there that the CISO can't possibly see. Think about Log4j. And I'm not saying that these systems have Log4j within them, but what other things do we not know about all of the components that are comprising these complex tech stacks? And the answer is, no matter how much due diligence we do, most of what's in there we don't know about. And that's why when I made the statement that forums like this are critical, the standards from NIST, I believe, are critical in sustaining and building these reliable supply chain systems so that operators, which I put trucking companies into by and large, can understand that risk, know how to properly integrate, know how to properly operate, and attain all of these supply chain benefits that our economy and our consumers and our people and our management and our investors, because stock investors matter, these are things that are expected of us. So those are the changes that have happened over time.
Yeah, thanks. Great insights from that industry. I think to quickly pivot, since we're getting close to the bottom, we want to move to the next topic soon. Larry, though, has looked across the board at a lot of different sectors, and also at what cybersecurity practitioners have done to manage these risks, emergent or otherwise. What have you seen, Larry, and how maybe is it key up with what you're hearing from Dave and Dan?
Sure. Well, what we see is that organizations struggling do the things that are necessary or important or required under the law. Cybersecurity is ethereal in many cases. It exists, but it's optics rather than reality. And we find that companies, after the fact, like after they have a major data breach or cyber event, a theft or something really nasty, until that happens, people aren't taking this issue seriously. In the IoT environment, some of the best and brightest people from an engineering point of view are involved, but sometimes the view is that the security people over there, they're annoying. They're not giving us what we need or giving us enough time, or not really, they don't really understand the issue. So there's this fundamental tension between doing the work that's necessary to create good products to basically making sure that the security meets a certain a level, whether it's defined by rules or law or whatever, but that balance is really very important. On the IoT side and the IIoT side, there are indicators of real improvement. When we first started the study more than 10 years ago, we said we were doing the study on IoT, people would scratch their head. What? IoT, what is that? We found that number one, people know what it is and they see it as very important. And I think one of the indicators of major change in this space is supply chain. We're seeing a lot of organizations trying to figure out how they get their supply chain to be more efficient, and these bumps in the road, taking care of them, hopefully in advance of product release. The only issue, again, I see is emerging, and this involves not just one technology, but many technologies across different industries, is building a relationship with the development side with the security side. The DevSecOps concept really applies to, in my opinion, IoT more so than other areas. But if you haven't looked into that, it might be something you may want to study. And if you had any interest in learning more about it, we could share with you what we have.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah. So I'm hearing across both from Larry, but also from specific practitioners like Dave, and we've heard in our work as well, is a difficulty in managing cybersecurity IoT risks. I think managing them for an IT system is quite difficult. It takes a lot of resources, money, attention to keep up with cybersecurity on a large system. On top of that, I think as Dave, and I'm sure you've seen in what you've looked at, Larry, IoT applications aren't in a data center. They're not in an office building always.
Right.
They might be truly distributed across the country and moving 24/7. It was part of the reason why our 8259 worked to plug that, NIST IR 8259. One of the key distinctions we made is this pre-market and post-market phase. It's one form of some of these challenges, or at least it was a clear form that it would exist for any IoT device, in the sense that once it's out the door, getting it back may be very challenging. So certain aspects of secure design or secure design processes, if they don't happen until later, oh, we realized 20,000 people's data leaked, so we need to put in a new chip to do a new encryption. Well, maybe you can recall the fleet, but you're probably not going to be able to do that effectively. I think the more consumer-oriented the product is, the more broadly or cheaply distributed it is. Not cheaply in the distribution necessarily, but if it's available for not very much, a lot of folks are going to buy a lot of them and use them and maybe even forget about them. And then they're going to exist possibly on the internet for some amount of time in a insecure state. And so post-market, you're as a manufacturer, as a supplier, your options are more limited for cybersecurity. And that's something I think I heard reflected in some of the comments here as well. But I think we heard the complexities that customers face with the way and so I think if customers are facing the complexity, our work's position is manufacturers should be responding not necessarily to they should, to the complexity that their customers are finding, make the devices more easy to secure, more supportive of the security that an organization needs. But I think what we're hearing is sometimes those requirements are much less than readily apparent, right? Something that goes into a truck, the need to update it, if you're only making computer devices, you might think it might take the time that you ask for all the devices back to put in the new chip for you to realize it's impossible for us to get all these devices back now, Fred. And the next time maybe you won't make that mistake, but a lot of it is what our work is trying to look at in this new risk identification area, is trying to shortcut some of that. Let's not learn by trial and error in IoT and IoT cybersecurity, but what are the good approaches to cybersecurity in different use cases. But on top of that are different customers. And so again, to plug the poll, which we're going to keep open for at least a little bit longer. And also, if folks have questions for the panel related to these topics, please feel free to put those through the Q&A interface here in Blue Jeans. The panel will be happy to answer your questions if they were to come in. But so to pivot now a little bit to customers and how customers can also add to this complexity. You as a manufacturer may be able to design a product to how you understand it to be used, but if that's, in IoT especially, not your usual primary target audience, you may misstep in that. You may not understand what a home consumer might need or what a truck might need versus what a business or an office might need. So you had mentioned it earlier, Dan, but to go to David Wollman now, you had brought up some interesting ideas around how solar panels being used in the home setting cause some, at least what you call them, gray areas in cybersecurity. Mind sharing with the group about that?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. It's recognized that we need to pay attention to the security of these PV systems and the smart inverters that connect them to the grid. And more generally, this category is called distributed energy. And NIST and others have been working on this. I don't want to give you the impression that good work isn't being done. So, for example, the Smart Grid Program and the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. And our keynote speaker also talked about solar earlier today. For example, we've done NIST Tech Note 2182. We've done Special Publication 1832 on securing distributed energy resources. And there's some really good stuff in there, such as like the identification of a cyber demarcation point in between a customer microgrid controller and utility distribution operations. This is important because you can get solar PV systems that might be owned and operated by a customer, or owned, operated, or managed by a third party, an aggregator, or connected and managed by the local utility. But if you think about it from the perspective of the residential homeowner, they may not have any knowledge about the cybersecurity and the risks or the vulnerabilities that they may unintentionally introduce in their, energy IoT residential environment. In general, what should we do if it isn't clear that a potentially responsible consumer or user is capable of fulfilling their cyber responsibilities? The likely answer is that some other entity has to step up and assume that responsibility, and we've talked about that with respect to manufacturer operators, et cetera. But it isn't crystal clear what you should do. For example, what happens if there's no owner of this system that can be identified? Maybe it was ignored or abandoned but still functioning. That might be a good question for folks is, how many IoT systems have they installed that they don't have contact with anymore? Or it might have been, created organically or even maliciously through a combination of IoT and the wild. I think of these kind of examples as unmanaged composition compared to other IoT security situations where there are clear responsible organizations actively managing risk. So that's what I meant by there's like this gray area here that deserves some attention. And it's likely relevant to some of the other IoT situations and interfaces. And it also extends to situations with humans in the loop. Remembering, as was mentioned earlier, that humans are not the best judges of risk. So I think, your consumer matters in this, and we have to take into account all different types of consumers. Thanks, Mike.
Certainly, yeah. Thank you, David. Certainly interesting perspective there about kind of responsibility, and I agree. Of course, it's not that there's necessarily a dereliction of responsibility in the ecosystem. It's a matter of complexity, especially with maybe multi-owner systems, or where the bigger system, the system of interest, crosses authorization boundaries, to pull in a word from the RMF, where who controls the authorization within that boundary is going to be different. Might be the utilities, might be the homeowner, etc. And I think you also bring up an interesting one, sort of abandoned systems. I know in energy, right, oil wells become abandoned, gas wells become abandoned. If those are retrofitted or outfitted with long-term use IoT devices and sensors, what implications does that have for cybersecurity? Perhaps very little relative to the environmental implication, of course. But one thing I think about around our work is sort of cybersecurity and its interaction with particularly environmental forensics. In that case, if there is an unmanned oil well or gas well that's leaking to happen, there could be sensors outfitted on it in the future that can be relied upon over time, even when it's unmanned, to monitor those gases, right? But sort of the cybersecurity implications of who continues to manage that device, if it's completely unmanned. There's a mandate that you have to put these sensors on the wells, but once your company goes bankrupt, who takes up the updates, right? Maybe a trivial example. I'm just trying to really draw it down to something that we know happens in the real world, and there could be cybersecurity, but then of course real world implications of that cybersecurity, right? If we can't trust the data from these sensors, if EPA can't trust that a well isn't leaking and they have to send folks out there, that's a cost to taxpayers at the bare minimum, but also bad for the environment, not to go straight to money, right? The leaking, being able to monitor that may be the obvious benefit that can't be achieved because we just can't trust the data that's coming off of this device anymore. I think that's really, there's a lot of interesting ideas there. The last one you brought up was related to how kind of customers and their perceptions of risk can vary as well. I know, Larry, to bring it back to you real quick, your work has looked at risk perceptions as well, or perceptions of the risk and where they are, and how organizations at least manage those. Do you have any insights there related to how this might tie into informing us about different kinds of customers?
Sure. So the whole risk issue paradigm, very complex, even though we use that word quite a bit today, but the reality is being able to judge risk in this environment is nearly impossible if you set a standard too high. So you have to accept, at least at the initial level, that risk identification and implementation resulting from that could actually be imperfect, but it's an improvement. So risk perceptions and activities are, in many cases, very difficult, and in many cases, an absolute mess. I'll be honest, we do industry studies, and sometimes, we have to report to senior level executive in a certain industry, and what they're doing from a security risk perspective is inadequate, woefully inadequate in some cases. That could be pretty difficult. But we find that if you can kind of look at all the issues that you need to do as an organization, and you have the right standards, the right orientation to compliance, a prioritization and accountability, and ultimately visibility to an organization, you can actually improve the risk perception. But if you look at the different studies we've conducted over the years, a variable that seems to be like in rock, it doesn't change that much, is failure because of having the wrong risk perception. Either you're too easy or too complex, too difficult. Sorry for the depressing information.
Well, not unexpected from my own research for my PhD and all, in the kind of perceptions of risk and cybersecurity risk, and maybe some of the gaps that there are between, say, a security expert and a layman, so to speak, who I think even in a technical company, a lot of the employees may not be technical experts, right?
Right.
Of course, there are always, many times practitioners who are, and Dan, you're one of them. Again, I know you can't speak directly for Garmin, of course, but I know Garmin targets a lot. You highlighted all the different kinds of customers they target. So in your work, do you have any insights about how a manufacturer or any supplier can approach this challenge of different, maybe one product being useful to many different customers who may have different approaches to cybersecurity and using the product, or even just different product lines that target different customers, and how that impacts the kind of internal processes of the manufacturer?
I think if we could get to the point of technical innovation where we could signal intended use and we knew the target for who to signal that to. So in the case of your oil well leaking or whatnot, and the sensor sending data, the big question was who's looking at that and who cares? Who goes to monitor it? You contrast that maybe as sort of a government oversight type of use case in the oil well use case to something like somebody out on a lake using a recreational product to, fish, to help them find fish under the water. And really the only connectivity there in that product is really just for downloading some updates for little lake maps on that fish finder. So that customer out there on the lake doesn't care about all this security stuff. In fact, I've heard people tell me that, friends and family that use products to do that type of activity. They think we're all, up here worried about all kinds of nonsense that they're never even going to have to worry about. Try and tell them a little bit, peel back the onion and talk about some of the other things that we've mentioned, kind of open their eyes when I get that chance. But by and large, your consumer as one group is very different from your IT professional who might need that additional information for the securability of the product, as well as the ongoing lifecycle maintenance of the product. So that's really where I think if the manufacturer or producer, whoever was originally accountable for the product, could somehow, with the magic of innovation and technology, communicate some sort of intended use. We could agree on some ontology for usage contexts. This is home use, this is professional use, just as a couple examples. And we could get things to a degree where they're smarter about it and had a whole heap of user experience innovation. We might get to the point where I have a display in my home and I'm using it to monitor security cameras, right? Like I have these connected cameras connected to my Wi-Fi network as a home user. And I have this display monitoring. So its intended use is a monitoring function. And maybe I have an app that I can check, on my home and see who's outside, and look at those security cameras. But the moment I hook up my garage door to that display, I now have cyber physical interaction. And how could that display or that system essentially communicate to the home customer, hey, Jack, you just connected this to your garage door. This wasn't the approved use of this original, IoT product. Mm. So I think that, manufacturer usage descriptions could possibly play a role there. But again, home Wi-Fi routers would have to be a lot more intelligent. And you have to ask the question, would the home user actually care if they weren't an IT cybersecurity professional? Or would they just ignore it and say, it's okay, I want to be able to open my garage door because that's cool?
Yeah, I guess, kind of to go back to bringing it to, I guess a problem that's because of the digital easy interoperability of products is, I think, part of what drives this challenge of expected use case becoming, I think, possibly easily divergent from how it's used. Intended use case, like I guess I was thinking of, if you wanted to try to use an old camera flash as the light bulb in your house, probably wire that up and make it strobe at you, and of course, but it would be rather difficult to do. You right? Obviously, you couldn't just screw it in, but today we have the equivalent of like every light bulb you could ever imagine that screws into every other light bulb or every lamp, but every oven and everything. You just put a light bulb in whatever you want. Here, within the confines of kind of your general real world applications. But what you're highlighting there is this ease of connectivity, which is the sell of IoT. So it's interesting when you hear, I understand 100% that you're talking your own capacity there and how we can drive more understanding of intended use case, not necessarily the position of Garmin or anything like that, but the idea that, what we're trying to explore in our risk identification paper is that even the best well understood intended use cases can, I think, whatever way you want to look at it, reasonably drift over time. Either a manufacturer might want to consider them, well, there's money to be made, or, help for society in us supporting this kind of customer that was different than what we originally intended. But I think it also goes a little bit to this responsibility. If an unintended customer is one of low ability, not in any negative sense, but if they're, a home consumer, how, warning them is certainly the bare minimum, but what kind of support is necessary there to avoid, I think, negative impacts for that customer. But from what we heard across the panel, it's not just those home customers, right, that have issues with cybersecurity, that have challenges with applying cybersecurity to products. And I think, I know in my own work and prior to NIST, there is a bit of drift from kind of, you highlighted it, Dan, folks at home feel a certain way about something. They go to work and they might be a banker, and their decisions on how to secure that bank are made based on how they feel about the security on their boat. And that kind of bleed of understanding, I think a professional is good at separating that, even if you don't always practice what you preach, so to speak, right? You don't have the best cybersecurity, or maybe, you do things that, you avoid certain products entirely, even though they're probably secure, but there's that 0.01% chance that you maybe as an expert, too much. And so you avoid it, and when it might actually be not such a big deal. That can work the other, when it's just a lay individual, they bring their lack of knowledge wherever they go. And as technology expands into every facet of our lives, including work, that's only going to increase in challenge. So we have some discussion. The next topic will be, I promise, it's not all doom and gloom. We'll be talking about some of the solutions, and one of those questions came up. We'll be getting them in a bit of a Q&A break here. I wanted to get in some of the audience questions. Close out our first poll. We have heard that we had about 20 or so, 30 or so people participate. So appreciate all those votes. Technology and use cases just about tied as the most influential for risks. Customers coming in with 18% of the vote. So a good split, which is also how we see it here in NIST, I'd say, at least at this stage. If you have comments, of course, send them to us where you may think otherwise. But it seems like all three have a role, and it's really hard to determine, honestly, which is the most important without knowing what your use case, technologies, and customer is. I think, as we've kind of highlighted here, right, certain customers are going to take that device and secure it how they want to secure it, no matter what you do in some ways. But other customers are not going to care about security at all. And how much of, that insight can influence your cybersecurity, but should you build to nothing? Certainly not. It just means you should do more for them as part of the ecosystem, maybe. Automated updates being for them, quote unquote, not necessarily actively managing their cybersecurity. So to bring in an audience question that we can spend a few minutes on before we get into our final topic. Is there a recommended security control framework for IoT that is current? None. I know I could plug our own work. We have a IoT device capability catalog in the form of SP 800-213. That's kind of focused on responsiveness to 853 RMF security controls. And there are a number of informative references mapped to through OLEAR and in our documents, our team's documents, that many of them control security. They contain security control frameworks for IoT, or at least insights. But did the panel have any thoughts on this or their work? David Wollman.
Yeah, sure. In our division, we've collaborated with our information technology laboratory colleagues on the 882, which is the Guide to Industrial Control System Security. It's now a new draft 3 is out for comment, and it's now the Guide to Operational Technology. So in a way, it's not like specifically focused on IoT, but it pulls in that operational technology perspective, which is some of what you need to address IoT, where it's hitting the physical world and having impacts. So I think with this update and the broadening of it to operational technology, it's current and it's open for comment. So I think that might be a useful one for people to consider.
Oh, definitely. Thank you, David. We have one other question that we can get to quickly. How are multiple tiers of intended uses or users dealt with by suppliers, or maybe even by the users themselves? The example given, something that's useful for a medical situation, blood pressure cuff could be available for home use or in the hospital. Kind of how is that handled? And I guess, not to put you on the spot, Dan, maybe to tie back to some of your existing comments, I know Garmin, and you've seen products made for both professionals, to go in an airplane for a pilot to use, and then for somebody who knows how to work a boat, but just an average person, right? So are there any insights into the approaches to maybe products that are very, very similar, even the same product that might be used across different customers?
This all goes back to context to some degree. And a lot of times the answer starts with what the regulation imposes first, because aviation, for example, is heavily regulated space. And so I don't work in regulated aviation area at Garmin. I work in a consumer, like the home user type of area. And so the regulation in that area is emerging, and these the IoT labeling efforts are related efforts that cite any number of these different standards that could be applicable. And the difficulty is figuring out which one applies to which use cases and what the exceptions are. One of the nice tools, as far as the previous question, is that IoTsecurityMapping.com site for tracing to all the various different pieces there. And in my work, I tend to be focused more on the device itself. There are other teams that are focused more on the applications and the services. But harmonizing those, again, is really where I kind of come back to that, where I stated that earlier. There's really that need for harmonized standards because we're going to be told you're going to have to do X, Y, and Z. And right now, it's the different regulatory spaces that we operate in, depending on what market we're serving or what customer we're serving, sort of dictates how we design and build the product and how we market it, who we market it to. So an automotive infotainment system that's a business-to-business relationship is marketed through sort of a totally different process than something that is, like a fish finder for the lake use, that's just kind of put out there and advertised. So the marketing spin in terms of how things are promoted, or whether at all. So, in the former case, sort of an OEM type relationship, it's more of a relationship that's established, and the marketing isn't really what you would think of in the traditional sense. It's more building that long-term relationship with different, manufacturers there. And so in that role, we're one of the suppliers, right? Where we would be in that role.
I was going to say, maybe it goes back to supply chain in some cases for some customers.
It definitely does, but that's where the challenge is really who are we accountable to for the different requirements? And the real challenge is being cost effective. For us, it's really being cost effective with that paperwork that's required, and getting a hold of the appropriate people when questions arise around, hey, what's acceptable here for this particular use case? We think that this seems good from a risk perspective. Does everybody else, does the industry agree? And one of the key areas where that really kind of, I think, comes up is the one around interoperability. So just as an example, there are fitness scenarios where people will compete with each other on fixed trainers or run on treadmills, and they'll show collectively on a monitor their heart information up on that monitor. So that's already used in that context, and that information is already being willingly shared. So if we're told that we have to, per some new regulation, perhaps around especially wireless things is kind of a focus area right now in the EU. So keep that confidential. Does the interoperability for that use case, which already openly broadcasts that information, necessary? And who do we ask to get that approved? Is a question that I think would come up. So that's just an example.
Interesting. Great. Thank you, Dan. So that actually rolls us right into, these questions are great. They roll us right into our final topic. Before we get into that and spend our last 13 minutes or so discussing kind of what are some of the solutions and approaches to handling these complexities based in standards, frameworks, and conformity, we'll put up our next poll and our final poll for this panel. Another pretty general one, kind of get a pulse of the audience. Hopefully everyone can give an answer to this one. IoT offers the most benefit for individual home customers, businesses and offices, or industrial use cases. So the idea there being, where do we see the most bang for our buck in IoT deployments? I think all of these spaces have a lot of excitement around IoT. We know I can name a product that fits into each of them, but where does the audience feel the most promises for real, efficiency, productivity gains, system efficiency gains, reliability gains, all that kind of stuff? So give us your thoughts on that, and we'll definitely revisit those for the end of the panel. So Dan, you gave us a little bit of thoughts about how manufacturers can build to customers just now. I think you kind of showed us this idea of the regulations being so important, how you're marketing it, what part of the supply chain you are. All that kind of awareness is really important for manufacturers, that context as they build what they build and provide it to who they provide it to. Going a level above that, though, both in enforcing those consensuses, those harmonized consensuses that may be built across an industry, I think is a role for conformity assessment, and then reflecting those consensuses may be standards. In our prep call, we had some initial discussions about that I definitely wanted to revisit here. Us being NIST, of course, are always interested to hear thoughts about how standards can help these kinds of intractable problems, and how conformity can be built on top of that. I think Dave, Elfring, and Dan, you had some thoughts on that. Maybe Dave, you can jump in, start us off with some of your thoughts on conformity and how that can help.
As an operator, I think the standards are critical. They play a critical role. There's also a difficulty with standards in that they're unintended use cases. But think about we talked about context and use, and the use case determining the criticality. So you can have a manufacturer who creates devices of whatever variety, but the minute they become part of the defense industrial base, now they have to, at this point, attain to what's prescribed in CMMC, depending on their level of integration. And so the expectation changes, and it becomes somewhat regulatory, a little bit legalistic, which is part of the danger. How many times do we create? And I've created rules, policies, only to find out, well, that was actually kind of dumb in practice, right? I made somebody, log in 3 times to the same system or do something really extraneous. But I think those standards are critical, and we see people asking, is there a standard for this? Where can I go and look for this? Because as an operator, I may not be able to look deeply enough to decide what my risk from this is, and yet we're required to have that today if we get to things like CMMC, which I think examples like that play a key role in terms of making sure businesses and operators know what's expected of them. It can't be a multiple choice test. In some cases, you have to set that minimum standard. I don't particularly like PCI, and yet if I'm processing credit cards, guess what? I have to do these things because there's that expectation. In the old days, we used to go look at a product and it would say UL approved, and we're like, all right, I don't know what that means, but it must be good because it's got the word laboratory in it. It says it's approved. So I think we need something meaningful, though, and I'm not saying UL isn't meaningful, but something meaningful so that as an operator, I can look at say something from Omnitrax or one of these technology providers and go, how are they doing today? I go and ask them if they have a SOC 2 Type 2. What's the context for that? Is it useful? Somewhat. So I think the standards are critical. And I think in particular in the context of what the company, the product, or what it's doing relative, to the economy or for people or, safety, in cases of, medical devices, for example.
Yeah, certainly. I think that broad scope that IoT can pull in, it's a recurring theme that we've heard here today. I think it creates a challenge for standards perhaps too, that standards are sometimes focused on those particular domains. Here's a safety standard for an automotive vehicle, and then here's a cybersecurity standard for an automotive vehicle, be it a truck or otherwise, and how do you merge those two? And I think you highlighted, Dan, sometimes those can have conflicts. If at least information coming from different domains. Your example was around different customers who have kind of conflicting requirements that are hard to meet. But if safety says one thing and cybersecurity says another thing, how do you adjudicate that? Depends on context, at least, I'd imagine.
Yeah, interoperability versus security, or even right to repair has surfaced before. There's maybe conflicting areas and how to square that. We're increasingly locking down systems in ways to verify cryptographically that different components within the system only talk to each other by design, but then how does that intersect with right to repair where you can swap those out? So I think there's some higher level design work that remains in the industry to get to a point that we're meeting those, because I think today different manufacturers are doing it in different proprietary ways that are maybe not as interoperable. So that's one area.
Yeah, interoperability is key. And that brings us to, I think, maybe David Wollman, some of the work you've done in cyber physical systems around the CPS framework. I know that looks at it a little bit of a bigger picture. You give us some insights on CPS and CPS framework?
Sure. The NIST framework for cyber physical systems is NIST Special Publication 1500-201 as the overview. And it's applicable to IoT. CPS and IoT concepts have largely converged. One of the things that this does is it provides a systems engineering methodology involving facets, which are like parts of the system engineering process, and addressing concerns throughout those processes. And the concerns are grouped into aspects. And some of those aspects, there's a whole list of them, but one of them in particular is trustworthiness, which is the combination of security, safety, resilience, reliability, and privacy. So in essence, many of these, have their sometimes siloed approaches to managing and identifying risk. And one of the things that we did, and this was in conjunction with the working group that NIST had in cyber physical systems, is the security and privacy working group identified this combination as being very important to look at together. So that you can consider, what is the interplay between safety and security, for example, or security and reliability. And, that way you can do more of a balanced, kind of approach. And for example, we've even done things with trying to understand, can you do some automated reasoning over these kind of categories to help answer questions about, the relative merits and importance of various things. So I think the CPS framework, as you mentioned, is relevant to this discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, David. Yeah, definitely. This has a lot of resources, CPS framework, but I think also, it's federal government related, but I think the risk management framework brings in a sort of similar, it's maybe a bit more IT oriented, at least in the kind of how it's used, and therefore been influenced by those kinds of stakeholders over time, that community. That doesn't make it, we used it for IoT for the federal government, and any large organization can use controls like in the RMF or in the CSF to secure their system. And so there's a lot of interconnection between all of these documents that we encourage folks to explore. Let us know how they feel about. We have about 5 minutes left, and we have a couple more questions from the audience that we can dig into. One had come in previously. I think, Dave, you had something to add on the kind of what happens when a device sunsets. What can a supplier do if, just facing facts, they're not going to be around forever, but cybersecurity might be a long-term endeavor.
I wish I had an answer. It's actually a question I share with the person that asked it, because
Yes.
if I buy let's say a Chevy truck, I'm not trying to call out brands, I'm not sponsored, but we've got IoT and telematics embedded in commercial vehicles, but also our consumer vehicles, and they're potentially going into grid communication methodologies where they're interlinking, seeing, smart grid, what have you.
Mm-hmm.
But when that truck becomes 12 years old, who's still keeping up that software? It's a valid question. I applaud whoever asked it, because it's very observant. It's something I think about all these IoT systems as well. What do you do with them when this product ages out and suddenly it's no longer in somebody's product catalog?
Yeah. And it's not an in-theory thing as well. That was part of the reason why I brought it back up. We had discussed it at the time, that's why I didn't want to bring it up in the conversation, to just bring us back to a point. But I think kind of now when we look at these solutions and mitigations, kind of, I think documentation, right, from the discussion from the last panel, part of that documentation, the value of knowing what kind of expectations a manufacturer has about their own ability to support a product, realistic or not, truly. If I see documentation, or as a professional, I see documentation that a company says, oh, we'll be around for 150 years. They've been around for 10. Grain of salt, maybe Chevy been around for a while. Maybe I believe that a little bit more. But do I believe that they'll support that product? Like you said, kind of maybe highlighting, Dave, the understanding product life cycles in certain sectors, how that might impact just what the want is. And I think it's not just product sunsetting, it's component shift that we heard early on as well. It's cloud service provider changes. Now we don't have a cloud anymore, so anything we made that relies on the cloud doesn't work. We're a big company that we have a lot of products that rely on our cloud services right now, but maybe one day we don't want to do cloud services anymore, and we're not going to, so everyone's top voice assistants are just not going to work, because maybe unrealistic, but there have been smaller cases of that, where the brains of the device are essentially ripped out because the connections are severed, because company can't pay their bills to their service providers anymore, and now your robot can't do anything. It can say, I can no longer do anything, and that's about it. And obviously the implications of that for your robot may be small, but the implications for a trucking fleet might be very large. Any industrial application certainly could be large. But even for a home user, if I invested all this money in a car or a multi-$1,000 appliance that is IoT-ified, and only to find in less than the expected, how long I expected to use it for, it's broken, but only because I can't use the smart features on it anymore. It doesn't keep temperature right because it doesn't have a cloud access. That would be, not the best. We have we have more questions rolling in. I thought those were interesting insights. I think I'm going to go through real quick just to see. The one question I had on deck, I think we'll stick with that one as our final thoughts, is an obvious difference between IoT and general purpose computers is IoT software is special purpose, or at least the IoT application. The technologies are going to be deployed for a more specific use case. To put it in just for the questioner, to put in the language I think of when we're talking on this panel. So the question is, when we're thinking about mitigations and frameworks and approaches, should unnecessary software functionality be turned off? Should that be a focus of the risk mitigation? Kind of minimize what the device does. Quick thoughts around the room, because we're at the 2:15 marks.
Yes.
Whoever has thoughts, not everyone.
Yes, and as it relates to baseline standards, ETSA
Yeah.
EN 33645 has provisions that require that.
I agree with Dan. It's Larry.
Yeah.
Same.
Yeah.
Same.
Great. Agreed. Yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of one of the key things we thought about in our days of 59, but, you know, it's maybe easier said than done. You know, I think a lot of, you know, how do you do that is part of what the question is. He's getting at a framework for understanding what's necessary and what's not. That's all the time we had here today. Thank you to all the panelists. It was a full discussion. We had more questions and I'm sure more discussion that we could have brought up. A lot of interesting insights around the cybersecurity risks in IoT and how they might influence products and how they're designed and what they're responsive to. Again, a huge thanks to Larry Ponemon, Dave Elfring, David Wollman, and Dan Hein for being here today and sharing your insights. Truly a great set of voices and a lot of new ideas that I at least hadn't heard before. We're going to take a quick break now for 15 minutes. Our next panel will come at, I believe it's 15. Let me double check that. Yes, there's apparently ending the panel early. So we can answer more questions. Excuse me on that. I had the wrong timing on my sheet here. So next question. App-to IoT needs to be decoupled from a manufacturer's service via an open protocol. Otherwise, devices fail to switch off those services. How can we understand the connections between, I guess to give kind of how I understand the question, an IoT device and its app, and what kind of, and all, I mean, I think it goes on as well to the kind of the back ends. How important is that and those kinds of connections between the technologies to the cybersecurity risks and risk identifications? So speaking from my role, as we've done it here in the Cybersecurity for IoT program, I think the interact, you know, there's a lot of understanding about, say, how to develop a good app, how to develop good software overall, the security on various operating systems that are available out there. So creating the app itself, I think, if anything, there's more guidance around that, more frameworks and standards, perhaps, than there is for maybe any specific IoT device. But the interconnection and basically how that app and its processes are used, I think there is a key. That's one of the big deltas for IoT, right? You know, you assume words get typed into a word processor, but if the engine for that word processor or whatever text under, you know, structure is being used to store data for a different purpose, does that have any implications? Maybe not, but that's the complexity of this. We can't say for sure one way or the other. And I think, you know, using the cloud for X versus using a different kind of backend for X, those different technologies have their own implications, but then how you're using it as well, right? If you're just storing data there, or are you processing in the cloud or on the back end, could have implications on what kind of cybersecurity is expected. So decoupling it is actually quite difficult. You can decouple some of it. You can decouple some of the baseline, maybe, if you want to call it that, right? Did you make a secure app? Did you minimize your security permissions? Did you use the encryption that the operating systems have to offer? But, you know, I think at the end of the day, if that device is also central to the operation of 100,000 IoT devices, because it's the CISO's phone app for all of the Qualcomm, just to bring it to one example here, all the, you know, there might need to be a little bit few more layers of security consideration about if that is that even a is that a good even secure use case? Should you even be doing that? I think, and that's a lot of should you be doing that is unfortunately sometimes the question in IoT, not just, you know, not always from the supplier case, but from a customer case. I think this whole idea of intended use, stopping and thinking, you know, not to put it on the customer, but there, you know, can it be done versus should it be done are sort of separate, you know, increasingly separate these days in IoT, right? I think a lot of things can be done, but maybe not. David, you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I wanted to tag along with where I thought you were headed. You can have single use, you know, kind of really focused, and then it makes sense to kind of close down functionality, you know, if there's some particular security risk that you're addressing. But, you know, in certain contexts, such as, say, in smart cities, there are IoT sensors and devices that have multiple uses. So in essence, you are building a measurement base that you can use for multiple purposes. And actually, you want to be able to reuse sensors because it's more efficient and cost effective in that environment. And in fact, we've looked at this with a Smart Cities and Communities Key Performance Indicators framework, which kind of gets into tracing back through some of the uses of this and being able to help a community prioritize, based on their goals, what solutions they may have in a smart cities context. But getting back to the IoT devices, having some ability to morph or modify just a bit to continue to provide value is also useful in these contexts. Now, it's going to come with some security risks that you need to understand, but just wanted to throw that out as one of those potentially emergent use cases.
Definitely. Thank you, David. Thank you to the whole panel. That will wrap us up for today. So I appreciate everyone's thoughts and all the questions from the audience and the responses on the polls. We'll be now taking a break for 10 minutes, and we'll be taking a